everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action. Today, I am excited to welcome Dr. Nima Rahmany. He is a leading expert in shadow work, emotion regulation, and healing attachment wounds. After a successful career as a chiropractor, he left the profession to dive deep into the realm of trauma healing and relationship transformation. Driven by his own journey of overcoming toxic patterns and becoming trigger-proof, Dr. Nima now helps high achievers, parents, and professionals break free from the cycles of codependency and self-abandonment. Well, hi to all my Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners. I am so excited for you to join me today. On the podcast, I have got Dr. Nima Rahmany. Nima, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to not only hear about your personal journey and, the experiences and the story that you have with learning about attachment and, what it's meant for you as an individual, but also learning about how it's kind of shifted your role. And, you've gone from being a chiropractor to now kind of this movement of sharing about your own story and how those parts of your life have become connected and how you're using all of that information to kind of support others who are going through that journey of healing from trauma and understanding their own attachment relationship. So welcome.
Thank you, Kirsty. It's great to be in communication and having this conversation. I'm excited.
My guests know that I always kind of start my episodes with a very similar question. Obviously, attachment is something that develops from very early on in life and it impacts us throughout life. And so I like to ask my guests, was there anything in your early life that you feel has kind of driven you towards the work that you're doing today?
Well, um, where do we begin? Was there anything that went through my life? It all began for me with a breakup. Here I am working as a chiropractor, helping people with stress-related issues, going through a divorce and several kind of failed relationships leading up to one that was so volatile with this push and pull dynamic that I really had to understand how can somebody who's intelligent, who helps a lot of people, who can really has a gift for being able to help people heal and see through their blind spots. How could I be so blind in my own relational dynamic where I am reacting and behaving in ways that I that shock me afterwards, right? And so it wasn't until things became volatile in my last relationship and actually abusive. We were abusive to each other. I became physically abusive to the point where I had to kind of break free and just pause and go, what the heck's going on here? And I discovered about attachment theory. And I discovered that, in a breathwork session, while I was in my healing journey, the experience of two specific events, the experience of being a twin and having my brother be born before me, and at the age of 2 being separated from my mother, memories that I don't even have, that I didn't remember, where in that moment, I became aware that that was a pain that was stored in my nervous system. And unconsciously, after that breathwork session was done, I was like, oh my gosh, that really explains the choices that I made in my relational dynamic. So it just set me on a journey to repair with those parts of me that I had abandoned a long time ago. And now my mess has become my message.
I love that that quote, that saying, however you want to put it, my mess has become my message. I want to first of all thank you for just being vulnerable and open and honest. I think that there aren't a lot of people that are able to own being physically abusive to somebody else. and that's not what we're going to focus on in this podcast, but I think
No.
it would be foolish if we didn't acknowledge that, you know, it's one thing to have these struggles and challenges, but it's another to actually stand up and say, I need to do something different. Like, this is not okay, the choices that I'm making. And you know, whether or not somebody else is a cause of that or a trigger, you know, and so it takes a huge amount of vulnerability to say, I'm owning that I'm doing something
Yeah, I'm taking care of my
unhealthy.
side of the street of this, right? I mean, there's always a dynamic involved. And when I came out with this and I've been teaching about it, people come to me and go, wow, I've been there too, right? On
Mhm.
either side of the fence. And I really wanted to heal that. And so it really, when we go through the healing journey, Kirsty, we really have to get out of the conversation of fault and blame, because
Mhm.
during attachment, during trauma bonding, during healing from codependency, there's always this experience of shaming and blaming. And as you go higher up in that frequency of healing and getting into love, getting into understanding, you realize there's nobody to really blame, because this is an intergenerational thing that we are born into, that we learn, we're conditioned to do. And so the work becomes to decondition the whole conversation of fault and blame.
I mean, I love that because I think when we get stuck in those patterns of fault and blame, we, I mean, what I just said, we get stuck there. We don't ever move beyond that. There's no healing. There's no growth. There's no progression. There's no change that happens. Um, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, now I've lost my train of thought. But
Yeah.
I do think that it's incredibly powerful though to be able to say, you know, I take accountability for myself and
Yeah.
my side. What how do
My
you
mess
say
is
my
my
side of the
message.
street? Yeah, exactly.
Totally. Totally.
Um, I wanted to touch a little bit more about, you know, your acknowledgement and recognition that what happened when you were younger, when you were separated from your twin. Like tell us a little bit more about that and how you kind of delved into that more and how you
Yeah.
reached a point of realization with that.
Well, I realized, and it wasn't conscious. And what I learned was that most of the traumas that we experience, the two things is, if it happens before we have the language to describe it, then these talk therapies, they're not really addressing it. That's why people will do therapy for 20, 30, 40 years, talking, and they're not getting to the root of it, is because what happens when these traumas happen before you have the language to even describe it. And I want to define trauma as not what happened to us, but what happens inside of us in the absence of a really safe and empathetic witness to process and move through all of that energy, to alchemize it. And without that, that gets stuck in our nervous systems. And so childbirth and the age of 2, I have no memory of it. But what happens is that separation, and here's the other thing I wanted to share is separation is also, all trauma is separation trauma. All trauma is actually separation. It's a separation from ourselves. And in those moments when mom wasn't there, or I was separated from my twin and my mother for months, while they were, my mom was kind of exploring emigrating to Canada from Iran at the time. It was a really stressful period in Iranian history. Um, in that moment, I separated from myself and I went looking for, kind of, there was this resentment that occurred with the feminine, this deep need to be seen by my mother, while at the same time a resentment towards the feminine. So here I am, that is in living in my body, and that unconsciously starts to inform the types of partners that I choose. It informs that, okay, I'm going to choose a partner that I know that will not um, trigger that abandonment wound. So I would kind of choose partners. I would become more of an avoidant because I was afraid of that feeling of abandonment. So I would choose partners where I wasn't afraid of losing them. There was kind of like uh, there was an imbalance in kind of empowerment where I wouldn't choose people that I was afraid of losing. I would choose people that I knew that I had no fear in losing, and I played this role of kind of the distancer. And I would
Mm-hmm.
constantly attract type of partners that were more pursuer types,
Mm-hmm.
which helped that I didn't have to deal with that abandonment wound. But that unconsciously was the frustration that was part of the push-pull dynamics in all of my relationships, from my marriage to the several failed relationships. And it wasn't until that trauma bonded relationship that woke me up and said, all right, this has become so toxic. It's never gotten to this point. It had never happened before to this degree. What is it that I'm missing? And that's when I started to understand that somatically these wounds are carried in our bodies, and they show up in our triggers. It's
Mm-hmm.
during when we get triggered. You can do all the therapy in the world, but if you don't get training on how to expand that space between stimulus and response and fill the cracks in the floorboards, you're constantly reacting from that 2-year-old self. And so that's how I put it all together, and I created a methodology called Becoming Trigger Proof.
Which I want to talk about in just a minute. One of the things I want to highlight, and many of our listeners are experienced in this field, but I kind of I want to simplify what you're saying a little bit and say this is what we mean when we talk to parents or caregivers about helping children process their feelings and like labeling feelings and recognizing what's going on in their body during that time. You said, it's trauma really is that somatic experience. It's what's going on inside of us. It's not what happens to us, it's what's going on inside. And then we have to process it in that context of a safe, empathic, responsive relationship. Um, and so I want to highlight that to people who are maybe like unsure about this. This is why we help children process what's going on so that they don't stay stuck there. And I've talked to a number of different guests who say, the same thing, like I was alone in my trauma, whatever that trauma was, and I had nobody to help me
Yeah.
understand like, okay, what you're feeling is normal and your
Yeah.
body feels a certain way and it's storing this energy. And here, let's process it together. Like, first of all, do the body piece, but then when we're out
Yeah.
of our back brain, when we're not in that trauma mind, then I can help you understand like the logical pieces to it. And
Totally.
obviously, with children, we can't do that right away
Yeah.
because their brains aren't fully developed. But
Yeah.
as you said, if we don't start that process, then it continued right into your adult life.
Yeah, this is where it begins. It's that when a child has this overwhelm of sensation through their emotional body, in an ideal world, the parent is going to sit down and is regulated and is able to bring them from activation into safety. But let's say there was an argument or there was a reaction from a parent, and the child is sitting there alone or in a timeout having to deal with these overwhelming emotions. What happens is the child doesn't say, my parents are just overly reactive. That's on them. I'm good. They don't make that conclusion. The child inside of all of us cannot live with the notion that the parents are malevolent or bad. They they deduce that because this happened, I can't live with the idea that my parents are the bad ones and I'm the good one, because that's not safe. It must mean that I'm bad and they're good. And so what we do as children is we abandon ourselves for the sake of that connection, because it must be that I'm the bad one. And so by abandoning myself and hating on myself, I can then warrant connection with my caregivers. And that little wiring of self-betrayal and self-abandonment for the sake of self-protection as a child turns into complex trauma,
Mm-hmm.
the imposter syndrome, not ever feeling like you're good enough, judging every time you have an emotion, suppressing your emotions because it creates this dysfunctional relationship with the self. And I've been spending my entire second half of my journey on this planet rewiring that and repairing that relationship with myself. So the trauma causes separation from self, and that's what the work is all about.
Mm-hmm. Um, so I guess tell us a little bit more about your journey of healing. And then we'll dive into a couple of the other questions that we have. So, how have you healed? I mean, I'm certain that you're probably still healing. You're going to be on
Yeah.
this journey for a long time.
Yeah.
But what helped you start that healing process after this realization that you had?
It's a fantasy to use the word healed in the past tense. And I'm very, very clear with that, my clients and students. And this whole notion, this fantasy that one day I'll be healed. Oh, when I heal my attachment wounds. And
Mhm.
we don't get to that place of healed in the past. What it is we develop the skill to work with whatever arises. And so that began for me after that relationship ended and I was kind of in a dorsal freeze. I started to learn about the nervous system. I started training in somatic experiencing, understanding the polyvagal theory and the various states of my nervous system, and realized that the majority of my life I was using personal development, therapy, anger management, all of these things as a covert form of invalidating my emotions. Once I learned the
Okay.
polyvagal theory, I realized that most personal development things that we do, most therapies, are an unconscious way to make parts of us wrong. And so I realized, I was like, wow. And so once I learned, it was the polyvagal theory was my access point to self-love. Because once I understood the various states of my nervous system, how my thoughts were, how my thoughts are aligned with my state rather than trying to change my state by changing my thinking. I realized part of my journey was I realized that I was trying to think my way out of feeling problems. I was trying to use modalities to try to stop feeling. And I realized the biggest shift was it's not about feeling better. It's about getting better at feeling all of my shame, my anger, my guilt, like changing my relationship to emotions themselves, expanding my capacity to contain sensations in the body, stored sensations, and work through them and get more vulnerable with, allowing and surrendering to my emotions. And really this is where I lead people through is you're in a trauma bond, you're stuck in a should I stay or go dynamic. 100 times out of 100, you have a dysfunctional relationship with your own emotions and you're with somebody with the exact same thing going on. So I started to understand the language of somatics. I started to understand the polyvagal theory and the concept of enmeshment, the concept of not having a boundary between my emotion and my partner's, and realizing that whatever she was feeling, I was bleeding that into myself. And then I started to understand the fawn response. Fawning
Mhm.
is basically uh, kind of like reflexive, programmed, conditioned people pleasing, where you abandon yourself for the sake of attachment, where somebody else's upset becomes yours. You can't separate between you and another person. So you end up abandoning yourself, saying yes when your body says no, creating all sorts of self-abandonment and self-rejection and self-betrayal and anxiety. And so the whole journey, I realized it's never about the other person. It was all about the relationship between me and the parts of me that I was rejecting and using personal development to try to eliminate. And so I learned how to get out of my head because chiropractor, intelligent guy, I could think my way out of problems. I could zone in and solve somebody's issue, but I couldn't. I was using this character of Dr. Nima to not feel, uh, you know, pathetic or not good enough, or, you know what I mean? So I went and I integrated what's called integration, finding compassion, understanding for those kind of darker, shadowy parts of me that I was using my identity of hero rescuer, Dr. Nima, to try not to feel. And I stopped distracting myself with women, with acclaim, with validation, with money. And I started to learn how to love that, those parts of myself that I abandoned. And so as a result, I could now sit in my own skin, and I didn't have to constantly be riddled with anxiety or imposter syndrome or go, 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 or inauthenticity, wearing a mask to try to people please or try to create some character to have you appease or like me. I could expand my capacity to have disagreement or, um, uh, I expanded my capacity to have differing opinions, have difference, but be okay with that. And so I learned how to become a secure human being. That's essentially it. You can't read your way through that. You can't talk therapy your way through that. You got to feel through that. And I created a system to be able to take these triggers, and instead of reacting like that child or the teenager, can expand and then integrate those parts of me that get activated during a trigger, and then return back home and then in safety into myself, and then communicate like an adult. So it's essentially learning how to become an adult rather than
Mhm.
reacting like a child or teenager. That's the journey.
Well, and the kind of the title for our podcast is "It doesn't have to be catastrophic." Like, I mean, you said that to me in our previous conversation, and I loved it. Like, and to me, what you've just described is you have reached a place of one, acceptance of your feelings. Like, I don't have to shut these down. I don't have to push them away. I don't have to pretend to be somebody else. I'm at a place of acceptance. And to me, I mean, that's one of the key facets of attachment, is having a person who is fully responsive and accepting of every piece of you, how you show up, the good, the bad, the ugly. Um, and
Yeah.
so it makes perfect sense to me that you've been able to move towards this place of security because you've become that person for yourself.
Correct. Yeah. Becoming, right? And it's a work in progress, right?
Mm.
And the deeper that you go, the more humble you become to, wow, I'm just here to learn, and there's you never get there, but I'm curious about the search. And here's the key about attachment. On the other side of that, I was able to meet somebody who is secure within herself. And it was weird to meet somebody that I didn't have to rescue. This is the key,
Mhm.
because before, my relationships were based on, I got to rescue someone so that I can feel important and so that I can be pedestalized by them. And that comes from an insecurity. And as we filled the cracks in the floorboard internally, I met somebody who didn't need that. And it was weird at first, Kirsty, to be like, wow, she doesn't like need me financially or emotionally. It's just, she's just there. And to once I found that state of unconditional love for me, I was able to, for the first time, love somebody that it wasn't based on what they're giving me,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It was like, wow, I could truly see her and she could see me. And our relationship now, when we have arguments, we resolve them like adults. And it's totally different not to be run by this push-pull dynamic. It takes a little bit of adjusting. There's two types of that inner work. One, the first type, where you do it as single, solo work. And then when you get into a relationship, That's a whole new ball of wax. All of your attachment stuff will come up. But now I have the skills and we are working through it together. It's our 5-year anniversary coming up next month in the recording of this. And I'm looking now, and my relationship is stronger with her now than it was in the beginning, which usually before it was hot and heavy in the beginning and then it would
Mhm.
fizzle out. But it's becoming stronger because I have the skill of repair, first with myself and with my partner. And now with our 4-year-old at the recording of this, he just knows that this home is a safe place. He doesn't have to live in a place where the home is like a battlefield the way that I grew up. Right. And it was interesting yesterday. I just asked him, I went skiing and I came back and he said, Dad, I really miss you. I love you. And then I said, Dominic, why do you love me? And he goes, well, because you buy me things, because you buy me all the toys. And I said, why do you love your mom? Well, because she helps me. And I just started reflecting is that before we do the work, we are that child, and the love that we have for others is based on what they do for us.
Mhm.
Right? I didn't understand what love was. I was like, of course I love her. Why? Because she does this and this and this for me, which was my son, my 4-year-old was reflecting as I was showing up in relationships like a 4-year-old, that it's
Mhm.
based on what are you doing for me. Now I love my wife, not only because she does so much for me. That's great. And we fulfill each other's needs in many ways, but just in who she is. And I was never able to see that because I was not able to see that for myself. And so that's why it is so meaningful for me to guide other people to that same realization, because I see people in their 30s, in their 40s and 50s still struggling with relationships. And I'm like, wow, I see myself in you. You were you're like my son. It's just, it's about extraction energy, right? Or the same kind of dynamics from childhood is like, I have to give, 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 hoping that one day it'll be returned, and it never is. And so if we don't heal those attachment wounds, we don't learn how to become trigger proof, we will repeat those unconscious patterns like I was. And the good news is it doesn't have to be that way.
Mhm. I mean, there was so much in what you just described.
Where do we
I
begin?
Well, yeah, I think one of the key points that I want to pull out is that what you're not saying is you're not saying that your relationship is this picture perfect and free of any conflict, right?
No,
It's
that
rupture happens, but
rupture
now you have
repair.
found a different way to repair.
Yeah, Kirsty, I have to tell you, I gotta say this. 90% of the work that I do with the people that I work with is dissolving their fantasies about what they think a relationship should be. And we create these fantasies in childhood to escape a really painful reality that one day I'm going to have this knight in shining armor and there will be unconditional positive regard and they will pedestalize me, and that's just the childish fantasy. And now, I have a mature, secure relationship, which means we get on each other's nerves and then we repair. Like there's a skill you can learn how to create that sense of safety. And that's why it's about dissolving the fantasies. And yes, I can bring her in here and she'll tell you that I'm not always a picnic and we'll have a laugh about it, right? And that's because we're human, right?
Mhm.
And so getting out of fantasy is like 90% of the work, Kirsty.
Mhm. I love that. I think I mentioned this to you in our previous chat, but some of the work that we do when working with the family and child dynamic is helping particularly the adult reach that point as well of dissolving this kind of fantasy relationship that they had, particularly if they are a foster or an adoptive parent, because that child is not where you are as an adult. You've been on this journey. You're still on this journey. That child is at the very start of that healing journey, and so helping the adult understand that the relationship is going to look very different because of where this child is at.
100%. Yeah. And the work of becoming trigger proof is how to embrace what's in front of you. When my child is, having emotions, having a meltdown, what's happening within you, right? It's like uh, the dog whisperer. Have you ever seen the dog whisperer? It's
No,
a
I
really
haven't.
neat show. You could just check it out. Somebody has a problem with a dog and they call the dog whisperer, and the dog whisperer goes in. They're like, "Could you fix my dog?" And then the dog whisperer is like, "It's not your dog, it's you." Right? And he goes in and trains the owner in shifting their way of being, and then immediately the dog shifts, and it's like, whoa. So it's about training the owner in
Mhm,
shifting who they're becoming, right? Becoming a leader, right? Otherwise, the dog perceives that lack of leadership and starts acting out. We're the same. Parenting is the same thing, whether it's foster, whether you're leading a community, whether you're a man leading a family, right? Whether you're leading a family, you're leading your children. They're responding to your energy, and this is not a fault or blame conversation. So I can already see people getting defensive and go, "Are you blaming me?" No, this is not a blame. This is a taking accountability for who I'm being in the face of a child who's having some challenges, right? And so I can become a victim to that, or I can really go within, repair with me first,
mhm,
parent the little one inside of me before I take care of the little one outside of me. So it's not about the kid and it's not about the child in front of you. It's about the kid inside of you.
mhm. Well, and instead of looking at it as well as blame, looking at it as an opportunity, and you talked about this earlier about giving grace to yourself, giving grace to where those dark, negative, unhealthy feelings, behaviors, thoughts are coming from, and saying, I don't have to be a product of those things. They are a part of me, and I recognize that, and I recognize the place where they came from. And now I can give them grace, and I can say, I don't need you anymore. I don't need that part of me right now. And I can show up differently, whether it be with a child or with a spouse or significant other. And I think that it just changes the way that we see ourselves. It changes the way that we see other people, that we all have these parts that aren't so helpful in
Yeah.
relationships.
Well, I
And
have a really neat school of thought of that, Kirsty, is that if you've ever read the book, if you've ever studied Richard Schwartz's work and the book No Bad Parts,
thoughts,
I really
yep.
integrate that into my work. And instead of kind of looking at them and says, "I don't need you anymore," which kind of gaslights these parts of us.
Mhm.
What I like to do is to get into a place of understanding, because these parts of us are protectors. They're protective in some way. And when we can observe them with curiosity and understanding, then all of a sudden they start to calm down because your higher self is online. Instead of saying that I don't need you, once you look and see that, oh my gosh, I need you when my higher self is not online. And when higher self, capital S, is online, I can look at these protective parts with compassion. And that's when they start to calm down. It's like a child when my son is like really like needing attention. If I turn to him and I'm like, "God, what is it? I don't need you." He doesn't calm down. But when I turn towards him in a calm manner with curiosity, what is it that you need? And try to get to understanding. Understanding equates to love. When you get to understanding, you're loving that part, all of a sudden you become higher self and the problem dissolves. You see a massive shift that happens internally. So the distinction is really important for me because I've been working on trying to get rid of these parts and saying that I don't need them for a while, and it hadn't
Mhm.
worked until I turned towards them with like a heart opening understanding. And now It's kind of like my executive is online and I'm observing these parts that are there. And if you can see them, you don't have to be them. If you
Mm.
can't see them, then they consume you. So it's a really neat way of playing with all our multiplicities. And that's one of the things that I had. Another part of the thing that I learned is I am not just one person. When you're looking in the mirror, you are looking at hundreds of different parts of you that show up to try to get your needs met. And
Mhm.
my work becomes to bring my adult self online so that I could meet those needs and they don't have to take over.
Hmm. Well, and it was so, I think this is what I was going to say earlier, but it's so interesting that you said earlier that you ended up abandoning yourself, which is, I mean, like I can't even explain it because that's what happened to you as a child. You had these feelings of abandonment and then come full circle, you've ended up doing it to yourself. Um, and I just see that as such a aha moment of like, wow, this is it. It started with protection, but ended up being so much more harmful. And, it's like this delicate balance of looking at an experience and saying, I did it to survive, but also it was harmful to me.
Yeah.
And being
Well,
able to balance that.
it's kind of a universal law is that the strategies that we use to survive childhood, they worked, right? That's how you're here. Thank God I did that because I'm
Mhm,
here. The problem is what got me here to survive is not going to get me to the next level. And so it's up to me to learn how to shift that old identity into a new one
mhm,
where it's not based on survival anymore.
mhm,
So
mhm,
that becomes the second half of the journey becomes all about loving those parts of me that I abandoned in order to survive. And that's, I think, that's our task, isn't it?
mhm,
We're all summoned into that journey. And it's just about
mhm.
finding the right guide that's going to help us get there.
Right. And just being that secure base for yourself. Yeah, embracing those all of those parts that are showing up. So
Whenever you get
tell
triggered, that's the skill.
right.
How do you know
Well,
where they are? They will show up every single time you get triggered. You're texting somebody, they don't text you back. Boom, those anxious attachment parts show up.
Mhm,
You want to say yes, you want to say no, but all of a sudden you feel like you're going to be a bad person. Boom, those parts are showing up. So it's the skill of learning how to observe how your body constricts. Those parts of us show up with an awareness in the body, and as you learn how to kind of connect with your body and you notice the constriction, and those that becomes your kind of bat signal call to action to go and find those parts and create safety and integrate. So I've created this methodology of rapid integration where you're able to observe your triggers whenever they show up, you know uh, in a push pull dynamic. When you get criticized, all of a sudden you get defensive. Boom, it's showing up. Integrate with that part before communicating, and now you don't have to create a conflict that turns into like a volatile argument versus one that can be easily doused because you repaired with yourself. So it is a skill that you can get better and better at, like skiing, like playing an instrument. And I just knew that my life depended on me mastering this skill.
and would you say that that describes a little bit about kind of the treatment approach that you have in terms of I'd written down like the lower levels of treatment as such as addressing that somatic piece, like this, what is this actual feeling? Where is it in my body? What's
Yeah,
happening? And then once we can recognize that, we start moving towards those higher levels, and thinking about more cognitive processing and then that integration piece.
correct. Exactly. In the moment when you get triggered, Kirsty, there is no cognition. You are now regressed to a child. And what you're doing is you're practicing noticing what happens in your body, noticing the constriction going in. And in our community, we do these trainings weekly. And then you're asking the question, all right, so um, they didn't they canceled the date for the third time. Okay. They canceled the date for the third time. Immediately, you notice this constriction in your body. You feel sad. You're triggered. You're activated. What are you making this mean about you? What am I making this mean about me? And so
Mm-hmm.
it's really digging and finding the hidden meaning. And the hidden meaning behind it is always a self-abandonment. I'm not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not worthy. Usually people get hung up in the beginning of this when they like, what are you making it mean? I'm making it mean they're an asshole. Okay, no, no. Let's not look at them. Let's understand their behavior. Let's move that aside and let's go internal. And then all of a sudden, that's when the tears start to come, the vulnerability. I'm not enough. I'm not lovable. And I'm like, okay, good. How old is this part of you? And that's when we're able to find the inciting incidents and these parts of us that have been activated. And the practice becomes to become the adult and fill the needs and parent the younger parts of us that get activated during these relational dynamics. Any relationship that you go into, even a secure one, will activate your younger parts. But we aren't taught the skills in repairing with these attachment wounds with ourselves. And
Mm-hmm.
so once you learn how to do that, now you're no longer 8. You've reparented that part. Now you can choose. All right, that's my third time. And you can advocate for that younger self and like, you know what, you deserve better. There was
Mm-hmm.
3 canceled dates. Sorry, this isn't working for me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you don't do that work, you could still fall into the trap of, and if you familiar, if you, what was familiar to you was a parent that just never showed up, and that's familiar, you'll probably go, okay, so when can we do our 4th one?
Mm-hmm.
You'll wait
Mm-hmm.
and hope that they change their mind and book a 4th one, thereby
Mm-hmm.
abandoning yourself again, giving the message that you're not, you don't have any self-worth, and that just keeps the behavior repeating. And then the person's like, why do I always date the same type of person? Why do I
Mm-hmm.
attract the exact same type of person? Well, my dear, you abandoned yourself a long time ago and you're repeating what's so familiar to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Until you stop looking out there and blaming out there and not blaming you, but finding those parts of you, you can then look and notice the pattern and go, oh, that was the 3rd one. I'm done. I can move on. It's a no for me. We're moving on. Right. And so this is the journey that we're all summoned to take on, becoming our healthy adult self.
Um, Nima, thank you so much for the conversation. I cannot wait for our listeners to hear it. I think that you're doing some really powerful work. When is the book coming out? Becoming
It's coming
Triggered?
out in September of 2025. It's called
Okay.
Becoming Trigger Proof, a guide to break free from trauma bonds, heal codependency, and create secure love.
I cannot wait for it to come out. I am looking forward to reading it, and then maybe we can look at you rejoining us again on the podcast for some
I
more
would love to be
conversation.
back if it aligns. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you
Oh,
so much.
also
Oh,
want
yes.
to give you in the show notes, my team has provided a link for people where they really would love to start understanding with their attachment styles. I have a quiz that is really detailed that helps you understand anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and it really goes through. And I just wanted to provide that quiz for anybody who was really interested in diving deeper.
Absolutely. No, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I think it will be a great resource for many of our listeners. So thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty.